going to look at the concept of consumerism, consumption, competition, capitalism and corporatisation. Big words, aren't they? The big five, the big C's, the quinella, the ABC, the quinella. And the reason I'm going to look at these five issues is because they form the basis of 21st century society around the world. Apart from a few pockets that are still living under different economic circumstances, 99% of the world is based on these five principles. Consumption, consumerism, competition, capitalism, corporatisation. Now, we're constantly told there is no other way. There is no other way of human beings organising themselves as societies. But historically there have been many other ways that human beings have organised themselves, from this nation's First Nations people as well as First Nations people around the world, to the beginnings of settlement with agriculture, onto a different hosts of economic structures. So capitalism is a very simple concept. It's about private investment for private profit. It's about private investment. Now, a lot of people think we live in a capitalist society. We do live in a capitalist society, but that capitalist society has now been refined and remodelled into a corporate society. And as I speak, we see the little bundle of brushes behind us burning as our planet is burning. Because we have a major issue with using principles that are based on profits for profit's sake, the creation of profit irrespective of the human, social, environmental costs that cause huge difficulties for individuals. Although currently we are in one of the most productive periods of human history, that period is about to end, as that pile of twigs is about to end, as a fire engulfed them. And the fire that is engulfing the 21st century is not religion or racial animosity, although they play a part in that struggle. But what is creating, what is the greatest threat that faces each and every one of us as individuals and human beings, is the fact that we are now entering a crisis. We have been in a crisis mode for a number of decades, but most people have refused to accept it, especially those who control the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. Because capitalism is in its purest forms, competition without regulation among people involved in private investment for private profit leads to the production of corporations. And these corporations begin to dominate, and now dominate, almost every sphere of human activity, whether it's social, whether it's cultural, whether it's religious, whether it's economic. So the end point of capitalism without regulation is corporatisation. Once you form a corporation, whether it's privately owned or publicly owned through a share register, what you have is large organisations which dominate activity around the world, manipulating the system to increase consumption of their products. Whether it's a product you eat, whether it's a product you use, or whether your own information becomes the product which is then used by advertisers through the new social media giants. So capitalism, unbridled capitalism, free market capitalism leads to corporatisation. Corporatisation means the end of human organisations which have been formed to protect people. It means the end of the nation state as the dominant force in society. Now, corporatisation and capitalism is based on one very simple principle: ever-increasing profits for a shrinking number of shareholders. Ever-increasing profits. And in order to create those profits, we need to increase consumption. And we need to make consumerism the new religion. And around the world, as people's religious ideologies break down, as nationalist ideologies become irrelevant, as more and more people are looking for some type of meaning in a meaningless society, consumerism becomes the driving force, whether it's in a developed nation like Australia or a developing nation. It's all about consumerism. It's about people being lulled into a false sense of security, thinking that if we continue to go on the same economic pathway, that we can continue to create growth ad nauseam. Initially through the exploitation of natural resources in the planet, and then through scientific applications, genetic modification, and many other ways of increasing profits. Now, consumerism relies on consumption. Consumerism is the ideology which is the backbone of 21st century society. Consumerism, the individual and society consuming products, consuming services, is what generates profits. And when that equation is put on its head through social media, where it's not your consumption of social media that matters, it's the facts, it's your information, your data, which is provided to social media, which gives it the ammunition to create profits by selling your data to other interests, again, to increase consumption. It's always about consumption. It's always about increasing consumption. Now, we are told that competition is the lubricant of 21st century economics. But the reality is that competition does not exist in a corporatised society. And we now see nation states passing regulations and legislation to not only break up monopolies and duopolies, but to actually encourage competition in the community, because the natural endpoint of unbridled capitalism, private investment for private profit, is survival of the fittest, survival of the strongest, survival of the unethical, the immoral. Because what matters at the end of the day, without regulation, regulation which is put in place to protect the community from corporate entities, what matters at the end of the day is the amount of profit which is derived from these organisations. And when states become dependent on the taxation revenue which is derived from corporates' activities, as we've seen with Crown Casino in Australia, whether it's detrimental to the public at large or not, doesn't matter. What matters ultimately is how much profit is derived, how much taxation goes into state coffers. So if we base our society on these 5 principles, consumerism, which is an ideology based on consumption, which is about buying and utilising services and goods in order not just to satisfy our basic human needs, but to satisfy manufactured demand. So most consumption is not based on the satisfaction of human need. Most consumption ultimately is based on manufactured demand. So we've got consumption, consumerism. Then we've got non-existent competition. In a society where there is no competition, because economic entities are so huge, they can actually destroy any competitors before they are able to become a major player in the marketplace. What happens is the corporations, which are currently exercising their power, actually decrease innovation. The more concentration of power and wealth in fewer and fewer hands, the less innovation. As we currently see in the universities, especially in Australia, where the universities have become basically an arm of the corporate sector. When university researchers, who are taxpayer funded, do the work in conjunction with private organisations to aid innovation and develop innovation and bring innovation to the marketplace, what we see is contracts are being put in place between privately owned corporations and individuals researchers, which limit the ability of the researcher to carry on any research which is detrimental to the company's bottom line. At the same time, with corporatisation and the increase in power that corporations have, they begin to dominate the legislative agenda. An unbridled competition in a capitalist society, a society which is based on private investment for private profit, creates a climate where the fate of the planet is irrelevant. The fate of First Nations people is irrelevant. So the fate of every living thing becomes hostage to an economic system which is based on unlimited consumption, based on manufacturing need, based on corporatisation, based on corporations being able to dominate the legislative agenda, so that when parliaments in so-called Western democracies pass legislation, the legislation never seems to touch the bottom line of these corporations, which are now described as too big to fail. We have seen royal commissions in this country, in Australia, into the banking sector, into the aged care sector, and a number of other sectors, which has highlighted the deficiencies, the innate deficiencies of these organisations because of the concept of them being based on the concept of private investment for private profit. We have seen the lack of competition which occurs in our society, and how corporations are able to not only dominate the marketplace, fix prices, destroy innovation, destroy any likely competitors, determine the legislative agenda, determine what laws are passed, create an environment which has led to a radical transformation in the distribution of wealth. 40 years ago in this country, for every dollar an investor made in profit through investing in some activity, 66% or 2/3 of that dollar would go back to the people who provided the labour to create that profit, and 1/3 would go to the investor. During the deregulation, privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation era, which we have survived, and which we may not survive, that equation has been turned on its head. 2/3 of every dollar which is made by an investor goes into the pockets of the investors, whether they're private investors, equity companies or publicly listed companies, and 1/3 goes into the pockets of the workers who create that profit. And why has that occurred? Through the casualisation of labour, through the destruction of the trade union movement, by the passage of restrictive legislation through Parliament, which makes striking illegal in this country, which gives a member of the CFM MEU less rights than somebody who imports $1 billion of drugs. They cannot refuse to answer questions regarding a union activity or a workplace activity they're involved in. Somebody who imports $1 billion worth of ice can refuse questions, answer questions legally. And the list goes on and on. So do we want more of the same? What will more of the same mean? What will be larger degrees of corporatisation mean? What will it mean that if people elect parliamentarians and then find that these parliamentarians do not have any power to challenge corporations, as we recently saw in Australia with the fiasco regarding Facebook? Has the Morrison government bent on its knees and begged for forgiveness because they wanted Facebook to pay a little bit extra tax? And the list goes on and on. Ultimately, what type of society we live in, if we live in a democratic society, and that's the key, if we live in a democratic society, is not held in the hands of the government of the day, which you elect every 3 to 4 years, is not held in the hands of the corporate sector. It is not held in the hands of the public sector. Ultimate political authority rests in the hands of the people, but only in the hands of a people who are involved in the political, social, cultural processes of that society. And that is the key: involvement. You can sit on the sidelines and complain all you like, and nobody in authority cares, let alone your neighbours. You can cry till the cows come home, and nobody ultimately really cares. You can sit in front of your computer and click to your heart's content, supporting every progressive social movement in the universe, and you will have no impact. You can listen to the most extraordinary protest music and songs, but ultimately you'll see them incorporated into the corporate music scene, and the list goes on and on. Ultimately, political power, social power, cultural power in a democratic society rests in the hands of an involved population. To limit your activities to casting a ballot every 3 to 4 years, to think that all the political activity you need to be involved in is to vote informal or not vote at all because you're dissatisfied with the current political process, makes no sense. It will not aid the development of a social, political and cultural movement which is involved in protest, which not only accounts those who exercise power, brings them to account, but ultimately is struggling to create a society which is based on cooperation, not competition. A society which is based on consumption, not for consumption's sake, not for manufactured need, but consumption for essentials. It's based on a society where people become involved in decision-making processes and attempt to democratise, devolve power and take it away from the hands of those who currently exercise it and place it in the hands of the greater number of people. And ultimately, it's a society which wants to see the wealth which is created in this society not hived off by a minority because they have been given a legal right to exploit that wealth, receive corporate welfare and pay limited taxation, if no taxation, but actually create a society which is based on the concepts of cooperative and collectives, which satisfies human needs, provides essential work for people, and ensures that the resources that we have in this country are not exploited by a minority for their sake to create a bevy of billionaires, while a significant number of people in this country continue to live in a difficult situation. If there is one country in the world where there should be no poverty, there is one country in the world where we should be tackling the issue of climate change, if there is one country in the world where we can welcome people to this country, if there is one country in the world that is in a position to deal with the health issues which currently face us, it's this country. So if you want change, I suggest you think seriously about joining public interest before corporate interest. We're not just a political party. Well, obviously we're interested in political elections because pissing on their doorsteps during an election gives them a little bit of heartburn. We're also interested in using strikes and occupations, protests, and any other form of peaceful protest in order to ensure that we can create that new society in our heart, which is based on cooperation, the devolution of power, and the sharing of wealth.